There's a town in the middle of the Sahara called Tagaza, and in the 1300s, the houses there were built out of salt. The walls, the roof, the little mosque, all of it cut from the ground in slabs and stacked like brick, because salt was the only thing the place had. Nobody lived in Tagaza who wanted to. The men working the mines were enslaved, and they ate food carried in from 1,000 miles away, because nothing grows in a town made of salt. A traveler named Ibn Battuta passed through in 1352 and wrote it down. He hated it. He said there was no good to be found in the place. And then he mentioned, almost in passing, that the salt those men were cutting got loaded onto camels, carried south, and traded for gold, close to its own weight in it. Salt, the same white stuff sitting in a shaker on a diner table right now, next to the ketchup. For most of human history, it was worth killing for. Empires ran on it. Governments taxed it until people picked up weapons. One quiet man in a robe used it to break the largest empire on earth. This is the story of how salt ran the world for 4,000 years, and what it did to the people who tried to own it. It's easy to forget this from a kitchen with a refrigerator humming in the corner. For about 9,000 years, salt was how you kept food from rotting. That's the whole game. No salt, and you couldn't store meat or fish through a winter. You couldn't feed a city that didn't grow its own food, or march an army for 3 months. Because an army eats, and the food has to survive the trip. Salt your fish, and it lasts a year. Salt your pork, and it crosses an ocean. Take the salt away, and your whole civilization is living meal to meal, hoping the next harvest shows up on time. So whoever controlled salt controlled whether everyone else ate in February. In Northern Europe, they figured this out and got rich on it. There was a town in Germany called Lüneburg sitting on top of a salt deposit, and for centuries, that salt got hauled to the coast, packed around herring pulled out of the Baltic, and shipped across the continent. Salted herring fed Catholic Europe through every fast day on the calendar, and there were a lot of fast days. The merchants who ran that trade banded together into a league, the Hansa, and the money from salt and salted fish built the churches and the merchant houses you can still walk past today. A pile of dead fish and the salt to cure it, that's what paid for the cathedral. If you can preserve food, you can tax the thing that preserves it. Governments noticed early. China noticed first and held on to the idea longer than anyone. The Chinese state put a monopoly on salt in 119 BC. It didn't end until 2014, the oldest monopoly on Earth, running for more than 2,000 years, and it was salt. By the Tang dynasty, the math got serious. After a round of reforms in the 700s, the salt tax brought in more than half of the entire government's cash revenue. Half! An empire of tens of millions of people, and the single biggest thing funding the army and the court was a tax on the seasoning. Control the salt, and you controlled the country, which is exactly why every dynasty that followed kept a hand on it, and why salt smugglers in China weren't small-time crooks. Some of them raised armies. You've probably heard that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, that it's where the word salary comes from, that somebody slacking off isn't worth his salt. Good story, mostly wrong. The word salary does trace back to the Latin salarium, and salarium does have salt, sol, buried in the root. But there's no record anywhere of a legionary getting handed a sack of salt on payday. The paid in salt version seems to come from an Italian dictionary in 1771 that guessed at it, and then everybody copied the guess for the next 250 years. I'm telling you because you'll hear it repeated as fact for the rest of your life, usually by someone very confident at a dinner table. The honest answer is we don't really know what the salt connection meant. Salt was woven so deep into Roman life that it ended up in the language, and the exact wiring got lost. Sometimes that's all the answer there is. Now back to that town built out of salt. The reason Tagaza existed, the reason men were worked to death, cutting blocks in a place with no water and no shade, comes down to geography. West Africa had gold, tons of it. What West Africa didn't have was salt. And the people living in the heat of the Sahel needed it badly, because the hotter you live and the harder you sweat, the more salt your body burns through just to keep standing up. So, two things that each region was desperate for sat on opposite ends of a desert: gold in the south, salt in the north, and the camel caravans ran between them for 800 years. In the markets down south, salt got close to its weight in gold. The legend says 1 pound for 1 pound. The real ratio wasn't quite that clean, but close enough that a slab of salt worked as a slab of money. People broke chunks off it to make change. The empire sitting in the middle of all this, taxing every load going both directions, was Mali. And the man who sat on top of Mali in the 1300s, Mansa Musa, became one of the richest human beings who ever lived. When he traveled to Mecca, he gave away so much gold along the way that he crashed the price of it in Egypt for years afterward. The fortune he was handing out came up out of a trade that ran on salt going one way and gold coming back the other. Same century, other end of the Mediterranean, Venice was running the same play with better bookkeeping. Venice started as a swamp, a cluster of islands in a lagoon with no farmland and nothing to sell, except the people there could make salt by letting seawater dry out in shallow pans. So they did. Then they did something smarter than just selling it. Venice used its navy to take over salt production up and down the Adriatic, then squeezed the competition until Venetian salt was the only salt. They ran it as a state monopoly, and they spent the profits on something clever. They paid their merchant captains a bonus for hauling salt, which meant a captain could afford to also bring back pepper and silk from the east and still undercut everyone else. Salt was the boring, steady cash that paid for the glamorous trade. The spice empire everybody remembers Venice for was floated on the stuff drying in pans out in the lagoon. It got bloody. Venice and Genoa, the other great Italian sea power, spent 100 years clawing at each other over trade, and salt was tangled all through it. They nearly wiped each other out near the town of Chioggia around 1380. Venice barely survived. Then it went right back to selling salt. The trouble with making salt your main source of government money is that you have to make people pay it, and people hate paying for salt, because they know it costs almost nothing to make and they need it to live. France learned this over about 400 years. The French salt tax was called the gabelle, and it became one of the most hated taxes the country ever had. The expense was bad enough, the way it worked was worse. In much of France, you were legally required to buy a set amount of salt every year from the government at the government's price, whether you needed that much or not. And the price swung wildly from one province to the next, so salt could cost 10 times more on one side of a river than the other, which created, right on cue, a giant black market. Salt smugglers were called faux sauniers, and France went to war with them. Get caught moving illegal salt unarmed, you could pull 10 years rowing a galley ship. Get caught with a weapon, you could hang. They'd jail you just for letting a smuggler sleep in your house. A nobleman caught buying black market salt lost his title on the first offense. By the 1780s, France was sentencing more than 3,000 people a year, men, women, and children, to prison or death over salt. Then in 1789, the whole country came apart, and the gabelle was sitting right there on the list of reasons. People had been writing it into their formal complaints to the king for years. One of the first things the revolutionaries did in 1790 was kill the salt tax and pardon everyone rotting in prison for smuggling it. It came back later under Napoleon, because governments have a hard time leaving salt money alone. By the 1900s, the British ran India, and one of the ways they paid for running it was a tax on salt. British law made it illegal for an Indian to make their own salt, even from the ocean a few steps from the house. You bought it from the British and you paid the tax, or you broke the law. In a hot country full of poor people sweating out salt all day, that tax reached every single person all the way to the bottom. A lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi looked at it and saw the whole empire in one small thing: foreign men charging you for something the sea leaves on the sand for free. On March 12, 1930, he started walking. He left his home with a few dozen followers and headed for the coast, a town called Dandi, about 240 miles off. He walked it in 24 days, and the crowd swelled the whole way, until by the time he reached the water, there were thousands behind him. On the morning of April 6th, Gandhi walked down to the sea, bent over, and picked up a lump of natural salt left behind by the tide. That was the crime. He held up a handful of salt he hadn't paid tax on. The British arrested around 60,000 people in the protests that followed. They arrested Gandhi, and the photographs went around the planet. An empire jailing tens of thousands of people over salt, beaten by a thin man who'd bent down at the beach. 17 years later, the British were gone. So what happened? Why is salt sitting in a shaker by the ketchup instead of crossing deserts under armed guard? We got good at making it. In the 1800s, people started mining rock salt on an industrial scale and pumping it up out of the ground dissolved in water, and the price fell through the floor and stayed there. The thing that built fortunes and funded armies turned into the cheapest item in the store. A pound of it runs less than $1 now, and most people throw out more than they use. And that town in the Sahara, Tagaza, where the houses were made of salt because salt was all the place was worth. It's empty. The mines played out, the caravans found other routes, and the walls dissolved back into the desert the first few times it rained. Pass the salt.